What's happening, New Hampshire? We're in the studio, the Manchester Public TV studio over here, filming another episode of the Jon Kiper Show. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Jon Kiper, and I'm running for governor of New Hampshire. So one of the reasons I'm running is because of housing. You know, it's a huge issue. As I travel around the state, all over, everyone is struggling with housing. And really, for me, this has been a problem for probably 5 or 6 years. I live in a 740 square foot apartment above a little restaurant that I own in Newmarket. And I've been looking to buy a house for 5 or 6 years so that I could have more kids and, have more space. My son's toys are taking up an increasingly larger amount of my house, and it's getting a little wild. So for me, this is a really big issue. And I've been seeing over the last 3 or 4 years, my younger customers have just been getting priced out of the state. They've been leaving. And now even my employees are saying, Johnny, we can't afford to live in New Hampshire anymore. We are going to leave. And, when I first bought my building in 2015, 2016, I got on the Newmarket ZBA, which, if you didn't know, is the Zoning Board of Adjustment. And so the Zoning Board deals with when somebody wants to build something that they're not allowed to based on current rules, current laws. And the first meeting that I attended, in which I was on the ZBA, was there was a younger guy who wanted to put an apartment in his dad's barn. And the barn was next to the house, but not connected to the house. And the people on the ZBA said, you can't do that. We would love to let you. We would love to let you do that because you want to take care of your dad as he gets older. And this would be very helpful if you could make this barn into an apartment. But because it's not attached to the house, we can't let you. And I thought, this is odd. I thought really it was a flaw in the way that the zoning code was written, that, that it was just a mistake, that we just needed to address it and have the town council fix it. And I quickly realized that was not the case at all, that nobody wanted, at least a lot of people did not want this to happen because they simply were afraid that it would allow for more housing in Newmarket. And as it turns out, a lot of people who own houses do not want there to be more houses, because of a number of reasons, which I learned as I got into this process. Now, after I was on the ZBA, I eventually got on the town council, and I kept bringing up this issue of, it's called unattached ADUs, or accessory dwelling units. But you can think of it just as a tiny home in your backyard. In Newmarket, like I said, we could not have tiny homes in people's backyards. And I kept pushing the town council and kept pushing the planning board. I said, hey, can we address this issue? And finally, after a number of hearings, I said to the town manager, I said, can we vote to tell the planning board, to tell the town council to change this ordinance? And he said, yes, we can. And we did it, and it took a while, but eventually it was finally legalized. Tiny homes were legalized in Newmarket. And it was kind of funny because about a month ago, my brother does architectural design. He said, hey, I got a job in Newmarket. I'm building a tiny home, and it's going to be in the backyard. And I said, well, you have me to thank for that because it was my advocacy and those other people I was working with that got that done. And that's the kind of approach we're going to need to take statewide to fix our housing problem. And to be honest with you, the ADUs, the tiny homes, might work in Newmarket, but it might not work in some other areas of the state. But the idea is we're going to need various creative solutions to address our housing problem because it is really fundamental to our economy, and that we have the housing for the nurses and the LNAs and the firefighters to take care of our aging population. Because as you may know, New Hampshire is one of the oldest states in the country. And in fact, the fastest growing demographic in New Hampshire is 65 and up, which grew 50% from 2011 to 2021. So the reality is we need more housing for young people. We need more affordable housing in general. And I brought on the show today a friend of mine who is an advocate for housing right here in the city of Manchester and has been doing that for a while. Welcome, Brandon Lemay.
John, thank you very much for having me today. I'm glad to be on the Jon Kiper Show for once.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what got you into housing, who you're working with now, and sort of what it's been like in Manchester?
So my name is Brandon Lemay, born and raised here in Manchester. I got involved with the local nonprofit, I want to say back in 2018, the Rights and Democracy Institute. But also I've been working with another local group called the Manchester Housing Alliance since 2020 on trying to get us more housing here in New Hampshire, or here in Manchester. We believe that everyone deserves a safe, affordable home. If they want to live and work here, they should be able to afford it. But yeah, I don't know. Do you want me to get a little bit more into like kind of what really got me like passionate about this?
Yeah, what got you passionate about it? I mean, so yeah, what got you passionate about it, and just what do you guys do?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I'm reminded of back in November of 2020, there was an encampment on the courthouse lawn on Chestnut Street.
And by encampment, you mean
Homeless encampment.
homeless encampment?
Yeah, and so at the time there were about 40 to 50 people who were unsheltered. And at the time, I called actually the number to check to see how many shelter beds there were in the state. It was 6. There were 6 shelter beds. And there were 50 people alone in this encampment unsheltered. And they were being pushed off under the orders of Chris Sununu and his Department of Health and Human Services. And in that time, I've been radicalized to see how we don't have any real solutions around homelessness and affordable housing. Those things are intertwined. Without affordable housing, there's just going to be more homelessness. And it became increasingly frustrating to us and our leaders on the ground when we saw that there were no supports. There were no beds, there were no houses for these people to go into. The only thing that the city and state government could agree on is that they just want them gone. And you can't arrest your way out of homelessness. You have to house your way out of homelessness. But in that time, through the Manchester Housing Alliance, we've advocated for basic zoning reforms here in Manchester. Currently, over 70% of the city, you can only have a single-family home. And as you know, we need more homes, and we don't have a lot of undeveloped land here, which means that we really have to look about how we're reusing the land. One thing that we've been a supporter of has been allowing things like ADUs. Currently in Manchester, you can convert a garage into an ADU, but there are a lot of restrictions on what can and can't count for converting something into an ADU. We would like to see more just by right. Like if you have like an acre of land in the North End, and you want to have a couple extra units in your backyard, and you got the plumbing for it, why not? But yeah, it's been a real challenge across multiple administrations here to get these zoning reforms out. We really want to see, more things like duplexes, triplexes, multifamily homes. And it is a struggle because a lot of people don't want to see change. Change is very scary to people. So I view it kind of as our job to talk people, through their fears. People are really worried. What if we did allow a multifamily home in my neighborhood? And we have to have the conversation with, well, what happens if we don't? What are the consequences there? How are we going to staff our businesses?
That's a really good point. It's not just what happens if we do, but what happens if we don't?
Yeah. What's the cost? And I think that we see that cost. I mean, it's homelessness. It's people feeling unsafe as a result in their parks, and I really try to empathize with that. And the solution is we need to have more affordable housing. There's no way that we can really get our way out of this. You could pay all of your employees, $50,000, $60,000 a year, and that still won't be enough to afford a 2-bedroom apartment.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to get people's living expenses down for them to have a better quality of life.
Yeah. I had an employee who lived in, I think it was somewhere in the Midwest. And I can't remember what city it was, but they raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And he told me that basically, this was several years ago, the landlords just increased the rent proportionally. And I honestly didn't believe him. This was 2018 that he told me this story. And I was like, oh, come on, man, really? And then with the pandemic, it was so crazy to see everyone get paid. I think you could probably say the average minimum wage is about 14 to 16 right now in terms of if you go to Target or Dunkin' Donuts. That's generally what I see.
Yeah.
And what happened? The rents went up, and it's as if the landlords just have this number that they can what is the maximum I can possibly charge?
Yeah.
And if wages go up, we're just gonna go up with that. I think it's really important for people to understand that inflation is driven by housing. Housing is the leading cause of inflation.
Yep.
So we might get the price of chicken down in the future if we get through bird flu, and we might get the price of lumber down if we have a couple good logging years. But this fundamentally is not going to change the price of goods at the grocery store or anywhere else in your life until there is more housing that will bring the prices for all of these things down.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Housing is 30% of the consumer inflation index.
Wow.
Yeah, and we talk about, we're seeing job gains, of course. We are seeing some wage growth, but unfortunately, that's being eaten up by things like housing and obviously, things like groceries too. But I would argue too that housing does increase the cost of everything.
Yeah.
Actually, a good example is education. It is expensive to educate children in places where it's expensive to live. You have to hire teachers that are going to stay. You're going to have to hire people to clean the schools. You're going to have to have people to maintain, serve food. And those things are only going to increase the burden that taxpayers are going to have to spend too.
Well, and that's what's so funny about this is like a lot of times people, I'm like a broken record on the campaign trail because everything loops back to housing. People are like, oh, we have a nursing shortage. Well, it's actually we have a affordable housing shortage because the nurses can't afford to live near the hospital anymore. And they're like, oh, we don't, we got to pay our teachers more and our school budget's going through the roof. Well, it's because of housing. It's like, there's very few issues in the state that really don't come down to a housing problem. Even mental health, I think, for not everybody, but for a segment of people, they're struggling with, paying 50, 60, 70% of their income towards rent or mortgage. And that's only going to cause depression, anxiety, just so much stress when you're just thinking about, work and how you're 1 or 2 paychecks away from homelessness. And I would say, it's hard to put a number on it, but 30% of this state is probably one medical emergency away from homelessness at any given time.
Oh, God,
yeah. And I have a lot of sympathy for homeless people because of this fact. But one thing that I've noticed, especially on the, on the social media, is there seems to be a lack of empathy for homeless folks in general. And I think a lot of times it comes from people that are living in close proximity to maybe a warming center or maybe a homeless shelter or something like that. And they're, and they're just, fed up and they just think, I see these comments sometimes like, we should ship these homeless people, back to Massachusetts, as if they are not from here or something and have no right to be here as much as anyone else. What do you say to people that are either feeling empathetic or lack of empathy or that feel that the problem could somehow be mitigated through some other way aside from building housing?
Yeah, actually, so I'm reminded, I do regular outreach. I go door to door a lot here in Manchester. And I encountered somebody on Chestnut Street the other day, and she said she took her dog to Stark Park. And she's a pretty progressive person too, and she mentioned that there was a man that she presumed to be homeless that was having a mental health crisis. And I empathize with someone like that because, we should be able to feel safe in our public spaces. But there are 2 ways that you can solve this problem. One way you solve the problem, quotes here. One is you can try to arrest your way out of it, or 2, again, you can house your way out of it. So I really empathize with people who do want, some sort of action. I think people are really frustrated, but they're not aware of what those possible solutions are. I think we here in America, are we have the mindset of just thinking, let's call the cops, they'll solve the problem, but a cop can't provide you with a lease and a key.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And I don't think the police appreciate being put into this position of being, the phone call of last resort for all of these problems.
Yeah.
It's like that's really not their job. What do you guys do with the Manchester Housing Alliance on a daily or not daily, but weekly, monthly basis? What does your schedule look like in terms of advocacy?
Yeah, so we have our monthly meetings. It's the first Monday of every single month at 7 p.m. We meet virtually, and those meetings we talk about what we're actually doing out in the community. It's great to be talking to ourselves, and we all agree that housing is a huge problem. But we also agree that we need to be out in the public. So one thing, we go to ZBA meetings, we go to planning board meetings, we go to the board of mayor and aldermen. We hold our aldermen accountable. We hold meetings with them to ask them like how is this project going, on Pearl Street that we're converting to affordable housing? Why hasn't there been a building permit filed yet?
Yeah.
Why are fewer of these units going to be affordable? And a lot of times in your local government, if you're watching this outside of Manchester, there are not a lot of people asking those questions. And keeping our public officials accountable is really important. And also, too, I want to point out that it's not even necessarily the mayors, the aldermen, or the selectmen. I don't know what you have in Newmarket.
We have a town council, but yeah.
But you'll find that your town or city has a very influential person probably running their planning department, and they have a lot of great information. And by talking to them, and they can help you understand the situation a little better. They can also be good people to push too. For instance, we've been trying to rezone, as I mentioned earlier, all of Manchester to try to include a little bit more housing density. So like that means if you have a single family home, maybe you could do a duplex, or you have 3 units, maybe you can have 4 units now, stuff like that.
Yeah.
What we found is a lot of planners, not even just in Manchester, around the state, are really reluctant to change any sort of zoning code at all. People, again, are really afraid of change, and they're afraid of plummeting property values, is the fear. And it's not always a logical fear. Because even if you think about this from the town's perspective, you are going to generate more tax revenue off of a 4-unit lot than you are in a single-family home. Like, that's just good fiscal responsibility, because single-family homes take the same amount of sewer lines to deliver water to. They take the same amount of electric, lines and all that stuff. So in terms of economy and all that stuff, it really makes sense to rezone, but there's a lot of reluctance. And like I said earlier too, the cost of not doing this is greater than the cost of doing this. It's going to result, if we don't do anything right now, we're not going to be able to staff our workplaces. We're not going to be able to get caretakers. And I always try to say too, if you are retired and you have, your own single family home that's hopefully paid off for, you are affected by the housing crisis too. You need people running the grocery stores that you go into. You need the people running the fire and ambulance services that hopefully you will never need. And it has a huge effect on all of us, no matter how healthy or how sick or how young or how old you are.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that baby boomers, 80% of baby boomers live in houses that they will not be able to stay in long term because of locations of bathrooms or kitchens, basically staircases.
Yeah.
And also 50% of baby boomers do not have enough money to retire. So they're the ones that are, I think, probably going to be and a greater portion of homelessness right now, and they're going to be 55 and up, is becoming a big part of the homelessness community because of the fact that they just physically cannot work anymore at a certain point.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the latest statistic, but about half of all new homeless are either elderly and or disabled.
Wow. Half.
Yeah, and keep in mind, these are people that worked their entire lives. These were people that may have worked for the city. They may have done some really important work. Many of these people are also veterans too.
Yeah.
These were people that worked hard their entire lives, but unfortunately in this country, you can't get rich by working anymore.
Yeah.
We have to subsist. Yeah, it's really sad to see.
Yeah, I think I have seen some good stats about veteran homelessness in New Hampshire particularly. Has been reduced to a really low number. And I think we should applaud the people that have worked towards that in the VA particularly. Now, how do you feel about the current Manchester administration, their approach to homelessness, and sort of, in an ideal world, let's say if tomorrow you were the mayor of Manchester, how would you approach it?
Yeah, so I'm going to say that this current administration is handling, I would say, housing and homelessness pretty much the same as the old way. And it doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican. Mayors love using the police against the homeless. And it has predictable results, which is it doesn't solve the problem at all. Now, if I were mayor, I would, and this is not popular, but we need to be investing tax dollars into affordable housing. It is the current philosophy and the previous philosophy of our administration here that the market is going to provide all of the housing that we need. And what we know from basic economics is that housing is inelastic in demand. That means that people will pay anything for this. People will not suddenly use less housing because housing's more expensive. They're going to pay as much as they can to get that housing. So I think that we need to do things like invest more in public housing, like the traditional way, when you think about HUD buildings, but also too, I believe in nonprofits also taking the lead in community land trusts. I'm a huge advocate of cooperative housing. I'm very inspired by the Champlain Valley Trust in Vermont that was established by then Mayor Bernie Sanders. And as a result, the people that live in those buildings get to run them democratically. They control their own housing, and it empowers people more so than like your traditional public housing. So I definitely favor the more like run by the people living there than the federal government. But I would say in the short term, I think we need to throw everything at it. And it's going to take public tax dollars because housing, in my opinion, is a public good. When we don't have it, it puts strain on our other resources, like we said. Instead of a mental health appointment or if you don't give someone that psychological, exam, that might lead to a costly, police intervention later. So, what's the saying? You got to be, penny. What was it? Don't be penny wise, pound foolish.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's I think one of the things about New Hampshire that we so frequently are is just, we're penny wise and pound foolish, and we end up paying in long-term costs such as ER bills. I heard a story about a guy in Phoenix that cost the city of Phoenix like $1.2 million. He was homeless in one calendar year. Just from ER visits, he was falling over, getting hurt. And they figured out, hey, it was just cheaper to spend 30, 40 grand to house this guy in an apartment, to have a nurse check on him every couple of days, than it was to spend $1 million a year to have him on the street. So this is actually, the fiscally responsible thing is sometimes counterintuitive for some of you that might be thinking, well, these people don't deserve free housing. Well, it's going to be a lot more expensive to let them live on the street. And one problem I have heard about, and I don't know if you've encountered this, but that there are some people who have been physically homeless for so long that the idea of housing is actually, they're almost like traumatized, that they don't want to go into housing, or they would prefer to be in a tent or whatever. Have you guys run into anything like that?
Yeah, well, you have to figure too, so it's almost like what causes what. But either you can become homeless because of something like PTSD, especially with veterans, or even being unsheltered can give you PTSD. So there is a lot of care that's needed. Particularly, there was an Iraq war veteran I ran into. This guy has PTSD, and he was being swept. It was a couple summers ago. And the guy was in Fallujah. He saw some of the worst things that you could have possibly have seen in the Iraq war, and he just said he's not ready for 4 walls and a roof yet. And I'm going to be honest with you, I don't know how to help that specific individual, but it's a worthwhile, endeavor. I mean, he put his life on the line for this country, and I don't feel like this country has really paid him back.
Yeah, I really don't understand why it would be so hard to have some sort of state or city, sanctioned camp area where it's like, there's toilets and there's showers and there's trash and people are just allowed to camp. I mean, what is the pushback against that type of thing?
So cities and towns are very risk adverse when it comes to things like lawsuits. They're really afraid that
the old insurance company.
Yeah. So they're afraid that if there was a sanctioned camping area, that like the city's insurance rates could go up. Someone gets hurt, they could get sued. Now I always say, well, you could just have them sign a waiver. You could have a private organization do it and assume that liability. So it's hard to say what is really an objection and what is really just kind of like they don't want the solution at all. And again, this is across Republican and Democrat administrations. It's not one party that is responsible for this line of thinking.
I mean, I think that's one thing about housing that's really important is it's really bipartisan. I meet people that are Democrats or Republicans or Libertarians or whatever that understand our need for housing, and I meet hardcore progressive Democrats that do not understand the issue at all and will talk my ear off about how New Hampshire is full, And what do you see as some solutions that, like I was saying, if you were mayor, or let's say were just had an infinite budget, well, maybe not infinite, but you know what I mean. If you could pass any zoning law or zoning change for the whole state, what do you think would make a dent in housing?
Yeah, so for instance, I'm thinking about those seniors that are aging in their homes right now, and I really like, there was a bill put out by former State Rep Ivy Van that unfortunately didn't get passed, but her idea was like, if you have like a big old Victorian home and your kids are moved out, maybe you're a widow or widower or whatever, and you want to subdivide that unit, you should be able to do that by right, but you can't. So I would say if you have a single family home, you should by right be able to at least make it into a duplex, no matter where you are in New Hampshire. And people are always afraid about ruining the character of the neighborhood, But if you've ever been in a neighborhood with duplexes, I mean, the neighborhood looks the same.
Yeah.
I would also to ease up parking requirements.
Yeah.
So in New Hampshire, many places, you need to have 2 parking spaces per unit of housing.
Yeah.
Now here's the thing: most houses don't have more than 1 driver. Actually, hold on, I need to revise that.
You mean
but many houses actually, especially seniors,
Yeah.
either have 1 car in their house, or they rely on things like a private service to get them around. So it doesn't make sense to mandate parking when a builder or developer says, well, my clientele doesn't need this parking.
Well, like 30% of people now, I learned this from Ivy Van, live in single-person households. So obviously they only need 1 spot. And I think about my parents who are, retired, and they have 2 cars right now because they have enough room for 2 cars, but they've had times in their lives where they only had 1 car and they got along fine,
Yeah.
And one thing that's really drives me crazy about the parking requirements is people are always obsessed with parking requirements. No one ever talks about increasing bus stops, train stations, or bike lanes, as possible transportation solutions. Is there any other things you want to talk about in terms of what you guys are doing, any ongoing events that people might want to know about with Manchester Housing Alliance, or?
So our next meeting is going to be this upcoming Monday, June, I think it's 4th or 5th.
Okay, yeah.
Can we, sorry. It's going to be the first Monday of June at 7. You can find us on Facebook, Manchester Housing Alliance. You can also email us at manchhousingalliance@gmail.com. We are planning on how to push forward this potential zoning change that we have. There's a lot of apprehension around this, I think, I guess with everyone. So we really want to be talking to, not even just those elected officials, but the people of Manchester.
Yeah.
We want to be doing outreach. We want to be going and tabling at festivals and talking to people about housing, trying to talk people through their fears. If you'd love to join us and learn how to scheme and to push forward this important, narrative that we have, that housing is just good for everyone, and not providing it is already costing us gravely.
Yeah, and I think one thing to remember is that this is a statewide issue, because what happens is, I live in Newmarket, which is 50% rentals. And when people can't afford to live in Newmarket, they don't leave the state immediately. They might move to a cheaper place, maybe a suburb of Manchester or maybe Rochester. Mm-hmm. And then when that rent goes up, they don't leave Manchester, they just move into their cars. And then when their cars break down, they move into a tent on the street. So this is a statewide problem that's going to need a statewide solution. And it's going to be, at the same time, really community by community, because what we have in New Hampshire that we love is our local control. But one thing I think it's important to remember is, we've let local control get to a point where the locals don't control anything because the locals got priced out 10 years ago. You know what I mean? And suddenly you look around and you said, hey, everyone that's on this board moved here from Texas or Florida. Like, who's really in control? So I just want everyone to remember that, housing is something that is not going to go away. It's not going to be solved unless we all communally decide that we're going to fight for housing together. Mm-hmm. And we're doing the work, and we would love for you to help us show up at your zoning board meetings and your planning board meetings and your town council and whatever, and just say, hey, we need housing, not just for me, but for my neighbor who's going to be homeless and will be if there's not more affordable housing, for my kids to stay in proximity to me as they get older, and for people that graduated college and went and lived somewhere else and now ready to come back and have kids, a house ready for them to go. So it's really important that we remember that housing is everything, really. It's the backbone of our civilization. So that's why, some of us are fighting for it. And thanks for watching, guys. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks for having me.